It sounds like the taxonomy and what you're talking about is a way of providing information for investors to know where to put their money. At what point does a recommendation become a matter of regulation? And can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah. So I think if we take a slightly broader perspective, for many years we've been hearing a lot about CSR, corporate sustainable responsibility, and that has been voluntarily, a voluntary regime basically. So companies have provided a lot of CSR information, but that has primarily been driven by the communications and public relations departments.
Right.
Because that has basically been marketing.
Right.
And what we're seeing now is a shift to sustainability and to ESG. And those rules are becoming much more clearly defined and are becoming mandatory. Mm-hmm. So if companies really want to work with this agenda, and they're increasingly forced to, they need to integrate it into their core processes. So in the financial sector, they need to incorporate ESG into their investment decision processes, in their risk control, in all the internal processes that they have as a financial company, and fundamentally integrate it into how they do business.
Theo, thank you so much for being with us. It's great seeing you again, and thanks for taking time to answer some questions.
Likewise, it's so good to be back. I'm so excited.
Great. So let's just start by hearing a little bit about what you do, what's your role. Regulation is not something that we get to hear about very often, so please enlighten us a little bit about what it is that you do.
Sure, Chris. Yeah, so I'm heading our sustainable finance team in the Danish Financial Supervisory Authority. Mm-hmm. And so we built up this team really because the whole sustainability agenda, the regulation of sustainability in the financial sector, that has really taken off over the past couple of years. And we were seeing a lot of regulation coming into force these days that affects basically the whole financial sector across Europe. Mm-hmm. And we really wanted to take a broad perspective of that, looking across the different parts of the financial sector, and ensure that we're working in a harmonized way with this new agenda. This is very cross-cutting, both in terms of what types of companies are being regulated, mm-hmm. but also the interlinkages between, say, climate change, sustainability, social issues, and financial regulation.
Theo, most people go about their lives, and we only get to hear about these things in passing. Maybe just very superficially, we all only hear the sound bites from the media. But can you explain to us in your own words what sustainability is and why is it important for society?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I think the most important thing to look at here, the foundation for this, are the two landmark agreements that have been agreed to universally, basically. And this is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. And together, these really form the basis for a more sustainable and just and safe world. So if you take these two agreements together, they speak fundamentally about both people and planet. So we need to develop a system, a society that works for people, that lifts people out of poverty, and give them access to services and let them prosper and develop. At the same time, we need an economic model and a societal model that takes into account climate change and that doesn't limit our global ability to prosper and as a human race to continue living. So we have a planet that is inhabitable for future generations. And this is the challenge we're looking at.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting because when we hear sustainability, we usually equate that to climate change. But what you're telling us is that it's much broader than that. It includes people, it includes justice, equality, dealing with poverty, basically all the scope of the United Nations SDGs, right?
Yeah. I think this is really fundamental. I don't think we can find truly global solutions to the climate crisis without also including a perspective on the people that are living on this planet. It's quite fundamental. We cannot tell the global south that they can't develop any further, that they can't burn any fossil fuels and not develop their societies. They have aspirations as well. So we need to find a solution where these people can prosper, and the whole world needs to come together around that. So I think any solution that is sustainable in the long term, that's a global solution, needs to really look at what are the societal impacts of the policies that we're developing.
Right, okay. And one of the terms that we hear very often said in relation to sustainability is net zero.
Yeah.
What is net zero?
That's a good question. So basically what science tells us is that the world is warming in proportion to the level of CO2 emissions basically on a one-to-one scale. And in order to get global warming down or stabilized, we need to stop emitting CO2. We also know that some sectors, some industrial processes will be very hard to completely decarbonize over the coming decades. So in order to stabilize the climate and stop more CO2 from getting into the atmosphere, we also need to suck out CO2 from the atmosphere. So net zero basically means that we're sucking out as much CO2 from the atmosphere as we're putting into it. And that needs to balance quite in not too distant a future.
Right, so in theory, the production of carbon emissions through the economy could in itself be kept steadily if we came up with solutions that could actually suck out more and more of that carbon that's being produced.
Exactly, yeah. Right. So there are massive investments going into carbon capture and storage, as it's called. What we're lacking currently are solutions that are really truly scalable.
Right.
There are a lot of interesting solutions out there, but they're still limited in scale. But that's a key quest. So we need to decarbonize on the one side, but we also need to really figure out how to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Right. Okay, so then what I'd like to try to understand is, what are the tools that you have as a regulator to help companies in this transition journey from current business activities towards sustainable business activities?
Yes, that's a really good question too. So from January this year, the taxonomy regulation went into force. And the taxonomy, there you have to take the old dictum that the more boring something sounds in EU language, the more important it is. Right. So the taxonomy sounds really boring and it's really important.
Very important. Okay.
So the taxonomy basically is basically a scientifically based framework for deciding what is environmentally and climate-related sustainable activities. So what is good enough?
Right.
What is good enough in terms of how we produce things in the industrial sector, for example? And we're supervising how the financial sector engages and what the products that they sell to customers and to investors, and how taxonomy aligned they are. So that's a key feature for us. But it goes beyond the financial sector. The taxonomy is a tool for all of Europe to really look closely and honestly at how good are we really. If we want to live up to Paris and limit global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees, how do we need to conduct our business? Okay. And that's basically what the taxonomy helps guide and gives us some specific answers to that. Are we in? Are we out? Is it okay? Is it good enough? I think that's a key tool for helping the transition. We need to transition all of our economic sectors to become more environmentally sustainable. And none of the sectors, the main sectors in today's world, are sustainable to a very large extent. So everything needs to change over the coming decades.
Okay, so the question I have now is that we seem to now be hearing a lot about this, and there's obviously a collective consciousness about the problem being propagated, right? There's more awareness of the problem. But it seems that a lot of the things that we talk about are plain common sense. So I think from a consumer perspective, it seems like it's the civil duty to make sure that what you do doesn't harm the planet, right? That you recycle, that you do whatever you can to optimize the consumption of resources. And from a business perspective, a lot of this sounds like, well, yeah, it makes sound business sense, right? That you need to be sustainable in your business practices, because otherwise in the long run you won't have a business to run. So why do we need regulation for something that seems to be common sense?
Yeah, true. So as you say, I think luckily most people are very aware of these challenges and are indeed adapting their behavior and their consumption patterns. However, I do think, and I'm pretty convinced, in fact, that we need systemic change. It cannot just rely on individual action. So you might know that the term personal carbon footprint was actually coined by BP Oil back in 2005. And they're obviously trying to responsibilize the individual while at the same time continuing at a systemic level, at a global level, to sell fossil fuel. So I think that's a good example of why we need to look at this systemically from a societal perspective. And it can be very difficult as well for consumers and investors to really know what they're buying and whether it's truly sustainable. I mean, I'm working in the financial sector, with the financial sector, obviously. If you want to invest in sustainable financial products, if you're an ordinary investor, it can be very difficult to figure out what is truly sustainable and what is just marketing itself as sustainable or 5% more sustainable than the average. Whereas what we need is to move to a completely different mindset.
Right.
And there we need regulation to really tell us what is in and what is out. I'm no expert on climate change. Luckily, there are some experts out there saying, well, a good the measurement is here. The goal is here. The best practice that's over here. That's this amount of CO2 emissions per ton produced of a given product. We can't all be climate experts. So we really need some scientifically based regulation to tell us how we need to act, what the boundaries are for our actions.
Okay, so then the question I have is, it sounds like the taxonomy and what you're talking about is a way of providing information for investors to know where to put their money. At what point does a recommendation become a matter of regulation? And can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah. So I think if we take a slightly broader perspective, for many years we've been hearing a lot about CSR, corporate sustainable responsibility, and that has been voluntarily, a voluntary regime basically. So companies have provided a lot of CSR information, but that has primarily been driven by the communications and public relations departments.
Right.
Because that has basically been marketing.
Right.
And what we're seeing now is a shift to sustainability and to ESG. And those rules are becoming much more clearly defined and are becoming mandatory. So if companies really want to work with this agenda, and they're increasingly forced to, they need to integrate it into their core processes. So in the financial sector, they need to incorporate ESG into their investment decision processes, in their risk control, in all the internal processes that they have as a financial company, and fundamentally integrated into how they do business.
Right.
And that's a shift. We're still seeing the type of regulation that is heavy on, say, disclosures. You need to explain clearly what you're doing and have an honest conversation with your investors about it. It is not demanding that you take a specific action or invest in specific products. So it's still more on the disclosure side. But the disclosure side, it's being firmed up very much compared to the previous CSR regime.
Right. Okay. And so I think what we've seen is that sometimes whenever a regulation comes in, there's moves in behavior and in consuming habits, and that causes an externality.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular concerns about the potential externalities that the imposition of regulation in Europe could have? I'm thinking maybe in the global economy where companies say, well, here I'm heavily regulated, I'm actually going to go over there where regulations are more lax and I can still produce and manufacture my products without so much burden of regulatory compliance.
Yeah. I think that's a good question. That's an important perspective to have as policymakers and regulators. I think in terms of the capital markets, we're seeing a quite uniform movement in the direction of increased ESG regulation. But what we're also seeing is that some companies are either spinning off their most polluting parts, selling them to third parties, thereby limiting their scope 1 and 2 emissions and making them scope 3 emissions. And we're also seeing, especially in the fossil fuel sector, that companies are going private, or parts of the companies are going private. So I'd say there's a fair bit of action in terms of decarbonizing financial markets, the capital markets. But what we are seeing is that private hedge funds are picking up a lot of activity and a lot of companies in, say, fossil fuels. And right now they're making a good profit given the high oil prices and gas prices. Right. So that's concerning.
Yeah,
it's very concerning. Yeah. And we need to make sure that we're not just supporting companies that are in sectors that are by definition not very CO2 intensive. We need to support the transition. So if we want to move to a carbon neutral state, we need to transform energy systems. The way we produce and use energy, that's 80% of the story. And part of that takes place in advanced economies, but an even greater part takes place in the global south, also with future growth in mind. So we need to allocate resources at a global level in a way that supports that transition, away from coal, away from oil, eventually away from gas, towards sustainable production patterns and consumption patterns.
Right. And so we talk about systemic change. Does the entire world economy need to be on board for a systemic change to actually be effective? Or could it be undermined by players that say, we're not interested in that?
I think change needs to start somewhere, and the power of ideas is pretty strong. So I think it's important to be a front runner. I think it's important to show the way forward and to really showcase how we can scale up sustainable solutions. So obviously Denmark has a tiny fraction of the global CO2 emissions, but it still matters what we do, because if we can, as a small advanced economy, if we can manage that transition, if we can show the world that we can manage to have economic growth and sharply decarbonize our entire economy, including hard to abate sectors, that can be an inspiration for others. And that'll be important in the climate negotiations. Plus, the solutions that we find here can be exported and used in other places to leapfrog technologies. The developing world doesn't need to go through all the technological steps that we did. They don't need to experiment with windmills for 40 years. They can just take the latest edition. The same with solar. Same with energy efficiency in other areas. So I think it's important to have some front runners.
Right. So this is the whole idea of leading by example, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And obviously we need most major economies, most heavy polluters to come around. Yes. That's obvious. We do need global solutions. It is not enough that Europe comes up with solutions. We account for 8 or 9% of global CO2 emissions. Obviously, we need the other 90%.
Yeah.
So it needs to be scaled up. It needs to be global. But there's no contradiction between moving at a fast pace in a small country and also having global ambitions.
Right. Okay. Now, last time we met in September 2021, you shared with us some sobering metrics about how sustainability goals were progressing in Europe. I think it's fair to say that we were behind with what's expected so far. Has anything changed in the past 6 months?
So that's a good question. There's, as you say, there's a lot of hype about sustainability, and everyone is showcasing how sustainable and climate friendly they are. And yet, when you look at the numbers, we're seeing few investments going into actual climate change projects, and we're seeing indeed very low numbers in terms of how environmentally sustainable are business practices today compared to, say, the EU taxonomy. And the picture is still the same, right. Unfortunately. In terms of financial products, there's been an explosion in financial products that promote themselves as being sustainable to some degree. And when you look a little bit closer, it turns out that a lot of them are not very sustainable indeed.
Right.
A large analytics firm called Morningstar recently scrubbed 1,000 investment funds in Europe from the list of sustainable funds that they are claiming to be somewhat sustainable, but in reality, when you're looking at them, Morningstar says they aren't sustainable in any meaningful way.
Right.
So I think that says a little bit about the problem, often referred to as greenwashing, as a catch-all phrase. But I think we are having some genuine issues here. And sometimes I compare an investment product to a car. It's shiny on the outside, but especially if in the used car market, you don't necessarily know very much what's inside. And I think there's an important role here for the financial sector to play in opening the hood and really explaining what's going on in there, and showing with a larger degree of honesty what it is that people are buying. Because in reality, most of the economy and most of the financial products aren't very sustainable. And by the way, those two things go hand in hand. We need that transition to take place. But obviously, from a financial perspective, you also can't develop truly sustainable financial products if there aren't any sustainable assets to buy out there. So there's a chicken and egg problem here as well.
That makes sense. Okay, and in your view, how can Fintech contribute towards sustainability?
I think there's some important contributions from the Fintech community that can be really made. So the first is data, the availability and crunching of data. A common problem for the financial sector is a lack of adequate, reliable data that is served at the right time. It's not delayed by several years because they don't have the necessary data streams to really make effective and timely investments. So, and that data comes from different sources. So data collection, aggregation of data is important, and crunching of data is important. So I think that's one obvious area where Fintech can play an important role. And obviously, as we've seen, there's a democratization of financial markets that where Fintech can also play a role in giving people an ability to understand better what is actually going on, what are they actually investing in, and have them get a better view of that, which I think is also very helpful because it strengthens their ability to have a conversation and to decide what they want to invest in.
Right. And how can Fintech contribute to regulation, to your role as a regulator? Is there an angle to it? I don't know, maybe RegTech or the sort of trends that we see? Yeah.
I mean, Fintech has transformed the financial sector from the inside out. It's become very digital, very fast-paced and very innovations-driven. And obviously from a regulator side, we also look at those trends, and our supervision is becoming much more data-driven. So we're building data management systems, we're collecting much more data, we're looking at how we can crunch that data better, in terms of machine learning, in terms of building natural language processing capabilities, etc. So, as a regulator, we're not necessarily cutting edge, but we're definitely implementing, integrating a lot of these technologies into the way that we conduct our supervision.
Okay, and so you touched on something that's really, really interesting. I think that because regulation usually tends to follow innovation, right? So as a regulator, how do you keep on top of all the innovation that's happening in financial services? And what are the main challenges that you're experiencing keeping up?
That's hugely difficult.
I can imagine.
We spend a significant portion of our time really looking into technological developments. And obviously we always a few steps behind, and I think that's the way it should be. But we are developing IT capabilities. We are participating in events like the Fintech Week, where we've been speaking for the past couple of years. We've established the Fintech Lab, where fintech companies can come and explore different business opportunities in the financial sector. So I think we are trying to adapt quite dynamically to a more innovations-driven age.
Right. All right. And just to close, the question I have for you is, in light of the challenges and perhaps the difficulties that we see in getting this all together, because it's a mammoth task, right? It's enormous. Are you optimistic? And yes, no, and why?
I'm a cautious optimist. We are looking at some extremely important and hard to solve questions. I also honestly believe that we are seeing a change in perspective from large parts of society. We are seeing that systemic change. People want solutions that deliver also in the future. They honestly want to live their lives and invest in a way that is truly sustainable, where we don't impede future generations from living on this planet. So I think we are starting to see that systemic change that needs to happen. And there are, of course, generational aspects to it. Younger people are more engaged, and increasingly they have more voice. And I think they are making themselves being heard, and that is impacting decision making, regulation, the way market works, the way businesses conduct their activities. So let there be no doubt there are huge challenges ahead, but I do think that if we all come together and work, put our minds to this, we are able to change the way we live our lives and the way we emit CO2 into the atmosphere. So I think it is possible, and there's still hope, absolutely.
Well, with that, Theo, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been really eye-opening hearing your perspective and getting a glimpse into your world, which most of us don't really usually have an opportunity to do. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.